Thank you all very much. I'm happy to be here this morning. As Chris said, I've been around this town a long time, and so I think people think I'm more of an expert on impeachment than I may sound this morning. As Chris said, I came to Washington in 1972, in the fall of 72. I'd been at the Philadelphia Inquirer, came to work for National Journal at that point, covering economic policy, which I did for 4 or 5 years, and then moved to editing before I went to the Post in 1978. So as Chris said, I was here during the Nixon impeachment, but not actively covering it. I was writing about economics at the time. In 1998 and early 1999, I was one of the main political reporters for the Post, and so was covering impeachment in several different ways. In the sort of the early stage, when it was still in the House, I was dealing with a lot of kind of what the White House strategy was and some of the strategy in the House. Once it went to the Senate for the trial itself was covered by our Senate team, and I was doing kind of political analysis about that impeachment process. But I appreciate what Chris had to say. What I would like to do for a few minutes is go through the different impeachments, not just that I've lived through, but start with the Andrew Johnson impeachment, because I think that it will help give everybody a sense that no impeachment is like the other impeachments. One of the things, and I'm not an expert on the history of the founders, but one of the things that you get from looking at how the founders approached impeachment was that there was a belief that in one way or another there needed to be, in a sense, the ultimate check on federal officials, including the president. And the definition of impeachment is a little bit murky. Treason, bribery are pretty clear, but high crimes and misdemeanors are not. And I think that has been a source of debate and controversy over the years whenever impeachment has raised its head. The first impeachment with Andrew Johnson, so we went basically a century without an impeachment. And then after the Civil War, there was a big, serious fight about what the shape of the country should be post-Civil War and into Reconstruction, and how you bring the country back together, and what penalties, if any, the southern states that had seceded should pay for what had happened during the Civil War. And Andrew Johnson had been picked as Lincoln's vice president. He was not a Republican. He was a Democrat, but he was what they called a war Democrat, which is to say he supported the North in the Civil War. And Lincoln put him on the ticket in 1864 as a way to kind of bind up things to kind of a unity ticket. When Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson, who was a Tennessean, reverted in a sense to his Southern roots. And he and the radical Republicans in the Congress immediately started to clash over what should be the shape of the future United States. And Johnson was an imperious character and had clear ideas of what he thought needed to be done, which was basically to let the southern states back in without paying any penalty, and in a sense to put back in charge the people who had been responsible for secession and for the structure of slave-owning southern states. The radical Republicans did not think this was the way to go, and there was right after Johnson assumed the presidency, the Congress was not in session, and Johnson began to implement his views on what should happen and appoint people to to run the southern states and to begin the process of Reconstruction. And the Republicans in the Congress balked at that. And so there was a serious substantive clash going on between the president and the Congress about the future of the country, and kind of, in a sense, the racial nature of Reconstruction and how we were going to deal with it. This went on for several years, back and forth, and there's a wonderful book that was just published this earlier this year called "The Impeachers" by a historian named Brenda Wineapple. It's I think the fullest and maybe the only real account of the Johnson impeachment process. It's a quite rich book in the story she tells, and Congress eventually passed a law that said that the president could not fire a member of the cabinet without the consent of Congress. And this was done to prevent Johnson from firing Secretary Stanton, the Secretary of War. Johnson went ahead and did it. And there's wonderful stories of Stanton holding up in his office, refusing to leave. It's sort of a classic, wonderful game. And that became the pretext for Congress to decide to impeach Johnson. They had been moving towards something like this, but the Tenure in Office Act, as it was called, became the vehicle through which they began the impeachment process. Now, interestingly, because there had been so much controversy prior to that, it did not take very long for the House to actually impeach Johnson. I think it may have been a matter of weeks from the time this crisis actually hit to the time they decided that they would enact articles of impeachment. They drew up, I think, almost a dozen articles of impeachment against Johnson, and they struggled because they were trying to think of, everything they could put in there to obviously make it a stronger indictment, if you will. But they also were trying to figure out what's the broadest indictment we could bring, or broadest article we could bring, in order to make it carry weight when it went to the Senate. And so the latter part of the articles of impeachment had to do with the abuse of power. So they impeached Johnson, and it went to the Senate. And because this was the first impeachment that anybody had ever gone through, there was a great deal of debate about, is this a legal process, or is this a political process? The Chief Justice obviously sits as the head of the Senate in the impeachment process. The Chief Justice didn't have a clear sense of what it should be, so they were kind of finding their way. And one of the things that comes through in Brenda Wineapple's book is the degree to which, once this went to the Senate and became a trial, it became incredibly legalistic. I mean, obviously, impeachment is a political process, but there's also a legal process, and evidence is presented, and there's rebuttal evidence presented, and this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, to the point that a lot of people in the country became, they kind of tuned out. They became bored by the process. They couldn't follow the process. Nobody quite knew what was going on. Everybody was terribly frustrated. In the end, Johnson was acquitted by one vote, which was cast by a senator from Kansas named Edmund Ross. And if you have ever read Profiles in Courage, John F. Kennedy's book, he cites Ross as a profile in courage for having resisted what he believed was an unfounded effort to impeach Johnson or an impeachment process that really lacked evidence and that was in fact more of simply a kind of a reflex action on the part of people in a political battle who opposed the president. Wineapple has a different view of this, which is that this impeachment, the decision to impeach Johnson was about very big issues and issues worthy of an impeachment, which was about the future of the country in Reconstruction. And in her view, Edmund Ross was not a profile in courage, but in fact may have been somebody who had taken a bribe in order to vote the way he did. So there is historical dispute about the role of Senator Ross, but nonetheless, that first impeachment ended in an acquittal. So then we go another basically 100 years without a presidential impeachment. There have been a number of judges who've been impeached over the years for extortion or bribery or malfeasance in office, but we go to Nixon before we get to a second impeachment. And this one, in my estimation, is a kind of classic version of why there is an impeachment clause in the Constitution. I mean, you're all familiar with the history of Watergate, I assume. But it began with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee, and it with the great reporting of Woodward and Bernstein and the strength of the editing of the Post under Ben Bradley and Katharine Graham, the Post began to uncover what was a much larger conspiracy to in essence subvert the Constitution and to cover up what had gone on. This was a process also that went on a long time. The Watergate break-in happened in June of 1972. There were some burglars who were arrested. There was a trial. People began to go to jail, and people began to talk through that process. And there was a judge here named Judge Sirica, who was a very tough-minded judge who was overseeing that, and who helped to break open some of that. That led to a series of hearings in the Senate under a Southern senator named Sam Ervin, and those began to fully bring out the evidence of what had happened. It was before the Ervin Committee that John Dean talked about a cancer on the presidency. It was before the Ervin Committee that a White House official named Alexander Butterfield revealed that there was a taping system in the White House or in the Oval Office, which then gave everybody the realistic prospect of finding out exactly what was being said day by day, hour by hour by the president. Obviously, a long legal battle ensued over obtaining those tapes, but those were the things that broke it open. And once that began to happen, and other White House officials were being charged criminally, it was inevitable that Nixon was going to face impeachment. At that point, the scene shifted to the House Judiciary Committee, which has responsibility to begin the impeachment process and to draft articles of impeachment, and that that happened in the spring and summer of 1974, and the Judiciary Committee drew up and approved several articles of impeachment against President Nixon. That would have inevitably gone to the Senate, and I think Nixon would have been convicted and removed from office. Instead, what happened was that several senior Republicans, Barry Goldwater among them, Senator Goldwater among them, went to the White House after the Supreme Court had unlocked the tape that showed the quote-unquote smoking gun of Nixon saying, "We're going to cover this up." I mean, those are my words, but launching the cover-up. Once that came out, things moved quickly, and these senior Republicans went to Nixon and said, "You need to resign," rather than take the country through the entirety of the impeachment process. So the second and in my estimation the most serious impeachment that we've had, and certainly that we had up to that point, for clear abuse of power, ended without a Senate trial, but nonetheless ended with the removal of the president from office. You'll recall that a few months later, maybe 6 weeks later, Gerald Ford, who had become president after Nixon left, issued a pardon of Nixon, which turned out to be enormously controversial, as you can imagine. But Nixon would have been conceivably would have been indicted once out of office and convicted and gone to prison. Ford decided to spare the country that. That may well have cost him the presidency in 1976. That decision to pardon Nixon. So we get there in 1972. We go through truly a convulsive period in American history. I mean, to have lived through it in any capacity, whether you're a young Washington reporter as I was, even not covering it, or a citizen in the middle of the country or anywhere in the country. This was a tumultuous time. I mean, it came. We had gone through the 60s and civil rights. We'd gone through the assassinations of first John F. Kennedy, then Martin Luther King Jr., then Bobby Kennedy, the Vietnam War protests, and then Watergate. So we had gone through a decade of turmoil, and the country was, I think, at a point where everybody wanted to settle down and kind of get back to normal order, which for a time happened. So then we get to the third impeachment, and that's the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And this is a totally different kind of impeachment, because it had nothing to do initially with high crimes and misdemeanors. It had to do with sex, right? Bill Clinton had been under investigation for years, starting in 1992, over a series of things, including land deals in Arkansas, the famous Whitewater case. And there had been special, an independent counsel appointed to look into all of this. He had been accused of womanizing by a woman named Paula Jones. There was a court case underway on that. So he was an embattled president, not for what he had done necessarily in office, but for private behavior or things that had happened before he had ever been elected president. In the process of the Paula Jones lawsuit and depositions, it became known that he had had an affair with Monica Lewinsky. And the story of that broke in January of 1998. I remember this distinctly, that in those first weeks, there was a sense that he might not survive it, that he would have to resign. The controversy was so large, but he, as you know, he denied everything, and in classic Bill Clinton fashion, did it in a very flagrant way. He on the day that the stories broke, he did an interview with, among others, Jim Lehrer, who used to be the co-anchor of the PBS NewsHour, and he was asked about Monica Lewinsky, and he said, "There is no sexual relationship." The word "is" became critical, which is to say, there is not at this moment a sexual relationship. So it was his first effort to try to avoid telling the truth. A bit later, he was in the Roosevelt room with a number of people in the cabinet, and if you haven't seen this, look it up on YouTube. You can easily find it. At the end, he says something to the effect of, "I have had no sexual relations with that woman." Then he caught himself, Ms. Lewinsky, and I'm going to get back and do the work for the American people, and blah, blah, blah. And on that basis, there were a number of people around him, cabinet officers, who staunchly defended him against the allegations that there had been misbehavior here. So this went on for months, this issue of what had actually happened. And Ken Starr, who was the independent counsel, added this to his investigation. I mean, it's one of these episodes where you learn that once an independent counsel, or now special counsel, begins work, that investigation can go in all kinds of directions, and that was one of the debates during the Mueller investigation, and one of the complaints by the president, which is that, well, they're supposed to be doing this, but they're doing this and this and this. But Ken Starr took this up, and in early September delivered a massive report to the Congress. It came out, as I recall, on a Friday afternoon. And one of the interesting things that happened was that they sent reams of documentation to the Congress, expecting that Congress would go through it and decide what to release publicly. And so what they sent to Congress was laced with all kinds of salacious detail. It's why we know all the salacious detail of what went on between Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. And the Congress instead just put it all out on public display, and which again then heightened the demand for impeachment. But what happened in the fall? Now, this was when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, and Gingrich was probably the most powerful speaker in modern times, until perhaps Speaker Pelosi, but also perhaps the most polarizing. And he was determined to push forward with the impeachment process. But what began to happen was that public opinion polls showed that the public was not in any way eager to see impeachment of Bill Clinton, and his approval ratings were very, very strong. I mean, well over 50%, and at times during the impeachment process, over 60%. Unlike Nixon, who by the time he resigned from office had an approval rating in the mid to high 20s. So Nixon had lost the country. Bill Clinton had not lost the country. And so we went into the midterm elections in 1998, and normally a president's party loses seats in the House during a midterm election. And instead what happened was that the Republicans lost a few seats. They still maintained their majority, but they lost a few seats in the House. And this, in a sense, kind of set things back, because Republicans then began to say, well, wait a minute, what are we getting ourselves into? To what extent are we putting our own party at great risk if we go ahead with this? And so there was a period in kind of November and early December in which there was a question of what might they end up doing. And there was some talk about censuring Clinton, which was ultimately what the White House decided they would prefer, but they weren't ready to say that at that point. I think they were hoping that they could head off the whole issue. The Judiciary Committee sent a whole series of questions, 81 questions to President Clinton to answer, and he submitted his responses, and it infuriated the Republicans because it was more legalese and dodging and language to avoid answering the question, and that was one of the triggers that pushed the House Judiciary Committee to move more aggressively toward impeachment. So there was this period in, as I say, in early December when are they going to do it? Are they not going to do it? What's the consequence? What's the price? And then it kind of crystallized in mid-December with the idea that, okay, they're going to go ahead with this. It was at that point, somewhere in that period, that Clinton basically offered more contrition than he had up to that point, and said, I recognize that I should be punished in some way, basically begging them to censure him but not impeach him. And the House turned its back to him and went ahead and impeached him in late December of 1998. So then the scene shifted to the Senate, and again at the beginning of it, there was some question among senators about, well, what should we do? Can we avoid a trial? Should we avoid a trial? Should we try to censure him? Should we do something short of going ahead with a trial? But in the end, they did. They went ahead with a trial in which evidence was presented, and the administration's lawyers countered Lindsey Graham was one of the prosecutors for the House, as was Asa Hutchinson, who's now the governor of Arkansas. They turned out to be very effective prosecutors and laid out a very tough case against the president, and then the president's attorneys had to try to rebut that. In the end, he was acquitted. He was not convicted, and so he remained in office. And there's a wonderful, I think it was just a week or 10 days ago, that former Senator Daschle and former Senator Lott, who were the two party leaders in the Senate at the time, recalled that within a day of the acquittal, Clinton was on the phone to them talking legislative business as if nothing had ever happened, and they moved on. So that was an impeachment. One of the articles was abuse of power, and another was lying, perjury, lying in a grand jury situation. But nonetheless, this was about sex, and it was one fought out against public opinion. And in many ways, both sides, but particularly the White House, approached it as a political campaign and not a legal fight. Their effort throughout was to win the war of public opinion in order to force the Senate, first the House, which they failed, ultimately the Senate, not to remove him from office. So now we get to today. This impeachment, I think we can see from the early stages of it, and I will not try to predict where this will go and how it will end up. But I think you can see from the way the White House, and particularly the president, is approaching this, that they see this again as a political battle. I mean, there's advertising on TV now from the president's reelection committee rebutting what's going on, or rebutting the allegations that the House has begun to investigate. The whistleblowers document. First of all, the rough transcript of the telephone call is obviously quite damning, despite what the president has said. The whistleblowers complaint is, as someone, I think it was James Clapper, said, the most thorough and well-prepared whistleblower complaint in the intelligence community that he had ever seen. This was someone who was not just a good observer, but a good reporter and a careful writer. And so that document also is damning. And things we have learned since then, particularly the text messages that came out last week after former Ambassador Volker testified before the House, that documentation buttresses and actually expands on what we knew based on the transcript of the telephone call and the whistleblower complaint. Now there's reporting that there's a second whistleblower who's coming forward. We will see what materializes in that. But I think at this point the House has a couple of questions to answer. These things sometimes look simpler and cleaner at first than they do when more evidence is presented, and particularly before rebuttal evidence is offered. And so we should not leap to conclusions about knowing everything that we will ultimately know, and it could be more damning, or there could be some exculpatory material that comes out that puts this in a slightly different light. I think a second issue is the experience of the Mueller report, which is to say, people had assumed things about the Mueller report and what it would trigger that turned out not to be the case. And we can debate why that is the case, but nonetheless, it fell short of what a lot of Democrats were anticipating would be the basis for an impeachment process for that investigation. So that's another question. The third thing that the Democrats have to decide is how broad or how narrow to make this investigation. And that we have seen through previous impeachment processes that is always a debate. How much do you load up articles of impeachment? How much do you kind of, rifle shot it? They seem at this point to have decided to make it narrowly about this, but I wouldn't assume that's the last word on that. So that's another question. The Republicans obviously have their own questions to answer, and very few at this point are willing to say anything, for some good reasons perhaps, mainly that they don't know the whole story and they don't want to, they won't prejudge it, but obviously because they know that President Trump will go after them, as he has gone after Senator Romney for the things Romney has had to say. So we're in this period now where we will watch this story unfold, and we will, all from various points of view, be reporting it. Let me just talk for 2 minutes about how you cover an impeachment, and because ultimately it's not that complicated. It's like any big breaking story, at a place like ours, I mean, we have a lot of people with a lot of different responsibilities for what will be done. We have our Hill reporters who are tracking what they can get inside the committees, and particularly the Schiff Intelligence Committee at this point. Anything that they're gathering and any information that they can get, that's kind of fundamental to what we're doing. Our national security team is working the other end of the avenue, which is to say the executive branch, and they've done. I mean, I just from the Post last week, some terrific reporting, as others have done, about what we have now learned and stitching this together and providing some of the context that we need to understand exactly what happened. As this goes forward, it will become, on the one hand, a legal fight, first in the House, and if it goes to the Senate, then particularly in the Senate where there is a trial, but also a political battle, which will be reported outside of those committee rooms and outside of Capitol Hill. This is a question of where does public opinion go? How is public opinion shaped during this period? If the Democrats push forward with this, are they able to bring the country around to the idea that that this is a worthy impeachment process? Speaker Pelosi has always said that ultimately it should be something that is done in a bipartisan way, not in a partisan way, and so that's the other piece of the story, and I suspect that that's probably where I'll end up focusing my attention, on looking at the political aspects of it, and particularly because it's going to come, if it does, in the middle of the primaries as the Democrats pick their nominee, and Joe Biden is right in the middle of all of this. So why don't I stop there and we can open it up for questions.
So, plenty of time for questions. So Daniel, we're going to go back to Zach.
How do you see Mitch McConnell's options? He said that he would, if he gets articles of impeachment from the House, he has no choice but to take them up, but he's also very shrewd. So how do you see that playing out in the Senate if it reaches that point?
Well, it may be that he believes ultimately that he's not going to lose that many Republicans and that Trump will be acquitted, and that for Trump that would be exoneration is in the way Trump would see it. So it may be that he is shrewdly saying, I'm prepared to take this process all the way to the end and let it play out, confident of how it's going to play out. We'll have to see about that. But it was interesting that he, in a sense, put that card on the table as early as he did and said, I have no choice but to go ahead with a trial.
Yeah.
Historically, what has been sort of the breaking point for members of a president's party to start saying either you need to resign in the case of Nixon, or to vote to impeach, or to vote to remove from office? Obviously, the context being the president's not going to be removed if Republicans in the Senate are not going to vote.
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's a combination of the quality of the evidence and the state of public opinion. As I say, in the Nixon case, there were a lot of Republicans who were reluctant to go the final step to say he should be impeached and removed from office until that last smoking gun tape came out in I forget whether it was late July or early August of 1974, and that kind of the dam broke at that point, and it was very difficult for Republicans to say, no, he shouldn't be. I mean, there will always be some loyalists who will stick with the president no matter what, but that was the case then. I think in the Clinton case, his overall popularity and the general state of the country. I mean, at that time we were in terrific economic times. It was during the tech boom. The economy was in very, very good shape. The federal government budget was balanced at that point under a deal that Clinton and Gingrich and the Republicans had cut. It was kind of good times in the country, and so I think that probably contributed to it. And also in that case, the question again was not whether Clinton had done something, disgusting and improper, and I mean, take whatever adjective you want to criticize him, but is this the kind of thing that you remove a president from office for? And I think that was an issue that affected people in how they decided. But as I say, I think that ultimately it's the combination of the quality of the evidence and the state of public opinion.
So a lot of this, because Intel's handling it, is going on behind closed doors, and it's whatever emerges a lot of times will come through leaks. Or how do you think that will shape public? Well, I have two questions. How do you think that will shape public opinion of impeachment? And what's your advice for reporting on that?
Well, my advice for reporting on that is if you're assigned to that, you need to do everything you can as quickly as you can to develop sourcing. I mean, that's the only way that you get this kind of information. And sometimes those are long-term relationships. Sometimes they're shorter-term relationships. But it's important to have a relationship with people inside who you trust and who trust you. I mean, because you want to get the information, you also want to make sure the information you're getting is right, because you have to be exceedingly careful. Any mistake in a situation like this gets magnified enormously. So, when we're reporting this, we are exceedingly careful, and in Watergate, the rule was you had to have two sources, and I think that in this case we're probably operating on a slightly higher bar than that to make sure that what we're getting is accurate. And one of the things that President Trump has been very, very skillful at is in a sense, delegitimizing his critics, whether it was Robert Mueller and the independent or the special counsel investigation, casting it as partisan and angry Democrats and deep state and everything. That had an enormous effect on public opinion. In a sense, almost no matter what Mueller came forward with, the country would have been quite divided over whether it was legitimate or not. And he is trying to do the same thing right now with this, although the evidence that is coming out contradicts his version of events, and his version of events continues to change. I mean, his rationale for why he made the call to President Zelensky has evolved over the last couple of weeks, and so he's on a little shakier ground at this point. But nonetheless, there is enough that he has thrown out, even information that has been discredited, that begins to take root. And the more it's said, and the more it's broadcast, and the more it's repeated by people, the more it filters down, particularly to Trump supporters, who continue to be quite loyal to him. So I think that's why this ultimately is very much a political battle as much as a legal battle. Yeah.
So something that was concerning me is that I have seen a lot of Republicans or Trump allies have for their own reasons, been skeptical of the whistleblower's complaint. Like they'll say that they don't know if this is the right idea because it's secondhand information or something like that. But then you hear people like Lindsey Graham or Ron Johnson who are saying that even if Trump is on camera saying that China and Ukraine should investigate his political rivals, they say that they find nothing wrong with that, which is like a totally different opinion. So I just wanted to know what you think, like how is that going to play in a Senate trial if that happens? Like,
Well,
if they're able to like spread that idea that something like that is okay.
Well, I mean, the political PR war is a fierce one, and also things are in the eye of the beholder, and also people have their own political situation to think about. Lindsey Graham's up for re-election in 2020. He saw what happened to Mark Sanford in his home state when Sanford went against President Trump, and knows that President Trump can destroy a political career. I'm not saying that's the only reason that Lindsey Graham is doing what he's doing, but everybody has various lenses through which they are looking at this. Ultimately, though, I think that as this goes forward, people have to make a decision about where I want to be seen in history, and that's an individual judgment, and we don't know how that is going to change. I mean, I think it's obvious that there are a lot of Republicans who are uncomfortable, to put it mildly, with President Trump, and not just for this, but for a variety of things. I mean, even his most loyal supporters. If any of you have been out and talked to Trump supporters, there's almost nobody who likes his tweets. I mean, it's like universal. I mean, I love him, but I wish he would stop tweeting. But nonetheless, they're loyal to him, and so there's certainly discomfort among Republicans on the Hill and around the country, but he is very popular with the Republican base, and they don't quite know all the evidence yet, and so their view is keep our powder dry. We don't have to make an ultimate decision at this point, and so I think that's why you're seeing what you're seeing now, and that's not that surprising, but we'll see as this goes forward whether those cracks get larger or not. I mean, and that's the challenge for Trump and for the Democrats, frankly, to persuade more Republicans that they should vote him out of office. I think at this point there's a consensus that if it goes to the Senate, he will not be convicted. But the question is that a reason not to go ahead with this? I mean, I think Speaker Pelosi said something the other day, which is politics has nothing to do with this. There are constitutional obligations that we have, and if we think that there is a president who is abusing the powers of office and or disregarding the prerogatives of the legislative branch, there is a process to check that. And at a point you have to do that regardless of the political consequences for your party or the other party. Yeah.
We have like 10 minutes, so whose hands are up? I want to make sure we'll get Ellie and Elizabeth, Caitlin, and Emma. And so I guess try to keep the questions on the fairly tight side and the answers on the fairly tight side.
So what is the biggest difference for you in this impeachment so far to the ones you've covered before? What feels different about this time to you?
It's a great question. I think the nature of why this impeachment process is moving forward. I mean, we've not had a case in which a president is being accused of, asking a foreign country to help bring down a political opponent. I mean, Nick Burns, who's a former senior State Department official, is now at the Kennedy School at Harvard, tweeted something last week to the effect of, in the history of the country, we have never seen something like this. Is it an impeachable offense? We'll see. But nonetheless, it's an extraordinary action on the part of the President of the United States, and I think that I think that that's what has made this one different.
This is more of a procedural question, but if the Senate does convict and the president's removed from office, what does that actually look like? Like, is he forcibly removed from the White House? What does that look like? What happens?
That's a great question. We don't know because it's never happened.
Yeah.
Presumably, there would be an orderly. The moving vans would arrive, and and the president would humbly leave the White House through one door or another, and the vice president would take over. But
Is it immediate?
I believe it is immediate. Yeah, I don't think. Well, I mean, yes, I think it is immediate. I don't know. Again, there's nothing that I recall from my reading that says if there is a conviction, the president has X days to leave. I suspect that what would happen is that there would be a discussion and a consensus about what that transition process would look like, and in a sense, how much time to give the president to leave and when the new president would be sworn in and that process. But we're totally in uncharted waters.
Right.
No.
Okay.
I also have a messaging question. With some of the president's closest allies, like Graham and Johnson, and some Republicans in the House, expressed a lot of concern when they found out that the administration was withholding aid to Ukraine. And since that hold's been lifted, and since the story has shifted more to leveraging that aid to persuade Ukraine into investigating Biden, those concerns seem to have gone away. So I'm wondering what you make of that, GOP messaging. I mean, do you think it's, in terms of, the political ramifications of that, I guess, going forward?
I think the calculation is pretty straightforward, and that is you can disagree, as a Republican, you can disagree with the president on some policy questions. And Lindsey Graham has done that on a variety of things, including a number of foreign policy issues. But you can't take on the president in the way that this impeachment process would do it. And so there's ultimate loyalty to the president and to the party, but within the family you can have some disagreement. And I think that's probably the basic kind of calculation that people are making.
So this is all unfolding right now. So with the potential second or multiple whistleblowers coming from this, being represented by the same law firm, which the GOP has now, said that has ties to Clinton and whatnot. Just given your previous experience, how concerning should this be for the Democrats? I guess I'm kind of confused why they're letting this happen.
Well, I'm not sure that they are letting it happen, quote unquote. I mean, whistleblowers seek out lawyers, and there are probably X number of lawyers who have the expertise to deal with these kinds of things, and so they tend to do it. It is certainly an issue that Democrats are going to have to think about and address, because the more it can be cast as a purely partisan exercise, the more that plays directly into the messaging that the president is using to try to undermine the entire process. Ultimately, the quality of the information that this second whistleblower has may, presumably would override that, but in a political debate won't necessarily override that. I mean, there will be people who will simply say that, this is a inside job, a hatchet job by people who have always had it in for the president, and they're looking for any reason they can find to try to force him out of office and to undo the 2016 election. I mean, it's like, it's the election that we will never quite get past, right? And so it's part of that. We were talking a bit ago about the question of secondary sourcing on the report. That's a potential issue, but presumably that's part of the responsibility of the Intelligence Committee, which is to not just simply say, okay, we have this report and boy, it looks bad and sounds bad, and so we're going ahead with it. They have a responsibility to do the investigative work, to find the people who the whistleblower had talked to try to depose them, and see what holes there are or aren't in their stories, to see whether everything adds up in the way that the initial complaint does. If the second person, the second whistleblower, has firsthand information, that would obviously strengthen the hand of the Democrats. But that's why we're in this kind of murky period, and the Democrats have to move fairly quickly. I mean, they can't drag this out forever. On the other hand, they have to do it efficiently and effectively. It has to be seen as a credible investigation, not a railroad job. And so that's a tricky thing, because at what point do you say we now have enough evidence and we can go ahead, or at what point do you say there's still some people that we haven't talked to that we need to talk to who might have something else that would push us in a different direction. So these are tough questions for people like Schiff. And frankly, I thought Schiff made a misstep in that opening hearing when he faked the phone call as opposed to just using the rough transcript. There was no particular reason to do that, and it just undermined him as the chair of that committee. And so I think those are things that at every step along the way, there are little decisions that get made that can ultimately become big factors in how the public at large sees this. So.
Okay, we have time for just one more. Jasmine hasn't asked one yet. It has to be this one. All right.
Well, I was just going to ask about the media ecosystem, like how that plays into all of this. And it's so divided. I mean, I was out in Elaine Maria's district, and it just seemed like the things I was hearing from Trump supporters, they'd come at me they were like in a different reality, really. Like, and they'd start railing about the border wall, immigrants, racism unprompted, that shift, they criticize shift a lot for that. I mean, how do you see that? Have we had that type of structure before?
No, we haven't. I mean, we were a polarized country when Clinton was impeached, but we're a much more polarized country today, and we now have a much more fractured media environment in which there's kind of a clear channel on the conservative side and clear channels on the liberal side, and not as much in between that people trust. The trust for mainstream media, quote unquote, has declined significantly, particularly among conservatives and Republicans, and that's a factor in all of this. I mean, when you talk about people living in different, in alternate realities, that's very much the case today. And people are not challenged to go outside those realities that they live in, and that makes a difference in how all of this is received, and how the country at large will make its judgments. And it's one of the reasons why I think that no matter what happens on this, it's not going to end in a clean way. I mean, it's always going to be a divisive, polarized outcome to this process.
Sanjana, if you can do it in 15 seconds or less. Yeah.
Your opinion on the Times reporting details of the whistleblower. What are your thoughts on?
We did not do it.
Yeah, we didn't either. But I wanted to know what your opinion was on, like, as details keep coming out, like, important to keep the whistleblower completely anonymous.
I think at this point, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the whistleblower process is designed to protect whistleblowers,
Right.
and I think that that's a good rule to follow.
Okay.
Until I'm overruled by Marty Barron.